10G, receive a report and provide direction to staff regarding acquisition of the Bayshore Circle median and alternatives for use of the property.
Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, this report comes to you after a very long time of interest and concern on the part of the City Council and the residents of the Bayshore Circle area. Staff acknowledges that this is a longstanding interest of the City Council, and we're hopeful that the report tonight gives you an opportunity to move forward in whatever direction you may desire, hopefully with the opportunity to produce a better appearance and hopefully some utility of this property in our community. Bayshore Circle is located in the 5th Edition neighborhood. The map that you have, the overhead visual that you have in front of you, gives a good perspective of the proximity of this open piece of land to within the neighborhood, extending north-south in the I'm sorry, it extends east-west in the eastern portion of the town, roughly running eastward from the front of the BART station. In total, the property comprises about 1.2 acres. It is situated between two residential streets that are both fairly narrow. One of them is a two-way street, one of them is a one-way street. Parking is restricted because of the width of the streets to one side. And as you know, this is a fairly densely populated neighborhood in our city, and one which is impacted, of course, by the narrowness of the street, and, as I indicated earlier, has been impacted for a long period of time by the visual character of this kind of massive open space. It's hard to even really call it a median. It's because it's so wide and so long. It is essentially where it has its historic base as a railroad spur line that was operated historically in our city by Union Pacific Railroad. The property was acquired by SamTrans, the San Mateo County Transportation District, during the early stages of planning for the BART line extension in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the BART line extension into San Bruno and beyond. Via agreement between BART and SamTrans, BART has been responsible since that acquisition for the maintenance of the property, and they do, I think, what could best be described as a limited job of maintaining the growth of weeds and the, again, a very minimal pruning of the trees. The city has coordinated with BART over the last several years in two manners. One is to require the annual cleanup of the property to meet a reasonable standard of fire hazard mitigation, as we do throughout the rest of the city. And city staff has provided some additional maintenance services to the area in order simply to provide a level of hazard mitigation, but in particular visual blight mitigation to the neighborhood. The City Council has previously directed a number of years ago, I believe it was in 2008, that staff review and report back to the City Council what might be done with this property. Should it, what was the broad range of options for utilization of the property? Should the city have an interest to potentially seek its development or its improvement for public use? At that time, staff presented a number of options, including consideration of actual building development, residential development on the property, given that it's actually big enough. But that alternative proved to be infeasible because of the location of utility lines and the dense population of the neighborhood as it exists in its current configuration. However, a variety of alternatives might be considered by the City Council for improvement of the property to a standard where it could be utilized either for a linear or bike path, some sort of a community garden, or some sort of active or passive recreational park use. The investigation or analysis of opportunities for utilization of this property have extended to conversations with BART. It has been somewhat difficult to catch their attention on this, but recently our conversations have proved worthwhile in that BART has identified that it would be potentially in its interest to transfer the property at a nominal price, and we have not engaged in any negotiations with the right people at BART, but are pleased to report to you that we do have their attention, and that attention is positive, I guess, in terms of their willingness to consider transferring the property. Now, again, that would be potentially complex because they don't actually own the property. The property is owned and titled by Samtrans, but I think it's a very good start. And with the City Council's direction, we would undertake what could be a potentially extensive work effort to negotiate, to unravel the property ownership issues and to negotiate both with BART and with Samtrans towards eventual transfer of the title, property title and fee ownership to the city. Staff would recommend, if that is the interest of the City Council, and then you wish to consider subsequently productive use of the property in a different manner other than just simply maintaining it, that staff would also strongly recommend that any consideration to acquire the property would include our analysis of any contamination issues that might exist on the property and might eventually impact the city's ability to utilize it in a different manner, and potentially the ownership liability issues that would accompany ownership of a property that might be impacted in that manner. Given its historic use for active railroad purposes, we can't predict, but would strongly recommend that we can't predict what types of impacts might be experienced by the property from an environmental perspective, but we would strongly recommend that any consideration to acquire the property include our initial effort to complete a phase 1 environmental review. That is essentially a document screen to determine what potential issues might exist, and that review could, and I would guess would likely, indicate the need for a phase 2 environmental review, which would include the sampling of soil materials and analytical review to determine what and whether there are environmental hazards present on the property. And a phase 2 environmental review could cost in the $15,000 to $20,000 range, whereas the phase 1 is relatively simple, as I indicated, paper screening that would cost, based on our experience with other similar projects, approximately $5,000, and could be done relatively expediently. So with that, staff would be pleased to hear your direction as to the next steps that you would like us to undertake in order to either continue status quo or move this property at long last to some other type of ownership and use.
Okay. questions of staff, comments? Irene?
One question, would we do the environmental review before we acquire the property so that if something is not quite right about it, it would be a factor in how we would acquire the property, or if we did?
I would strongly recommend the answer to be yes, that you would do that sooner rather than later. And in fact, given that we have Bart's attention, I would suggest that we do that with their permission, obviously, to access the property, but we do that, and access the records, that we do that right away as a first step, so that any additional consideration you might want to take would include the results of that review.
Okay, that would be good. And also, have we, and I don't recall ever doing it, but have we ever discussed with the residents on either side of the street or both sides of the street what their preferences might be? And if we haven't, maybe that would be a step in all of this, of what kinds of things they might like to see.
We have not engaged a formal public participation process. We have heard, and the council has previously had people who've generally given their opinion that there would be an interest for additional recreational opportunities, but I think the primary thing that I have heard over the years is an interest for a better and consistently maintained visual appearance of the property. Okay. There is also an interest within the neighborhood that I've heard having to do with additional, or the constraints on parking availability, and I would expect that to be a value of the neighborhood as well.
Okay, thank you.
Ken?
Is it me, or is there not an outward concern about a potential hazard, health hazard? If there's a prospect that there might be a contamination issue here or whatever, why isn't there, just go straight to the owner and say, take care of this now, before we even start discussing as far as any transition or anything? Because I can't imagine if I was living on that street. I mean, this is for me, it's like a new development that there's a potential contamination, and it's like, why wouldn't it? Because it was at one time railroad tracks and stuff. So obviously there's some maybe petroleum spills or something or whatever. So I just thinking, isn't that, I mean, we're doing the cart before the horse here. Is that, shouldn't we be demanding a clearance of this property first before we even start seeing about transition or redevelopment of it?
So let me explain the recommendation better. Thank you for the question. First of all, staff is not aware and is not anticipating any type of public health hazard. So the short answer to your initial question is no, there is nothing that we are concerned about or that we have any information about that suggests residents of the neighborhood should be concerned. It is prudent and in property transactions for somebody who is acquiring a piece of property to be interested and concerned about what type of what is the status of the property, and in particular whether with open land there is any type of situation on the property that might require remediation should there be disturbance of the soil in a manner that would be necessary for development of the property for any type of additional use. Again, staff is not suggesting and has no information to suggest any type of concern about a public health hazard. It is prudent to undertake environmental review of any property prior to considering ownership of it, because you own the long-term liability of that. And there may be issues that you would need to know should you want to move forward with any type of physical development of the property.
Rico?
Chair.
Let me answer one more question that I don't think you asked, but maybe you implied. And the short question maybe is, why isn't BART doing that? Because they don't care. They're not doing anything with the property. They have no interest in it. And there is no, other than the city acquiring it at the city's interest, there's no need for anybody to do anything.
I'm searching for some question for the city attorney that there might be some legal
I'm sure he's happy
vehicle
to
out
answer
there, that we can ask that question though.
I've been thinking of the answer to the question you haven't asked yet. I do think it's prudent to do an evaluation. Usually that happens either before there's any negotiations or even sometimes during the escrow period, there is a contingency for an inspection. I think in this case, unless there were some overt evidence that we already had, that there was seepage of contamination into the groundwater, for example, or those sorts of things, which we don't apparently have any evidence of, there really wouldn't be any basis to require the owner of the property to do anything unless they wanted to develop it themselves. So hence the staff recommendation to propose this sort of analysis before we make any further steps toward acquiring the property, if that's what you're interested in.
Just to close it out, we're satisfied that a phase one would answer a majority of our concerns.
Well, again, the city has no specific concerns as part of a due diligence to be able to advise you about whether the property would present a liability to us potentially down the road, and or there is any possibility of it being developed for any other use, or what it would take to develop it. This is an information gathering opportunity. Staff can't adequately predict whether a phase 2 environmental review would be indicated until we have the results of the phase 1 evaluation.
We don't necessarily have to do a phase 2. We could be cleared at phase 1.
You don't have to do anything in terms of environmental review. We would, or the assessment, we would recommend that we go down that path as an information gathering, so that you're fully informed.
Okay.
Through the chair.
Rico?
The city manager pointed out 2008 was brought up, and I think Scott Bushman might have been one of the gentlemen that stood before us and had brought this up at one point. And Vice Mayor asked about maybe the outreach to the residents, which I think is critical. They reminded me when I walked the area that they thought we had this in our preview of doing something. They kind of were telling me that you were bringing this up, that you were working on it. So I'm glad to see this come forward. So I will tell you what I have heard being out there is that they do feel the parking is an issue, as the manager indicated. That I know that BART is supposed to maintain it, they don't, the city does, and sometimes we don't get paid for it, or we don't at all. So in essence, we're already having money invested in there to not have it a blight, and that's just to obviously assist the residents, because who wants to live with that? So I think what you may hear is as far as parking and emergency vehicles going down that path, in addition to the cars that are not just on the sidewalk, they basically cover the sidewalk. And so I think that the residents, if we're able to do something, have been looking forward to it, as this gentleman has sitting here, and would love to see something go forward.
Okay. Anything else? The direction is?
I'd like to make a motion that the city manager go forward with the phase 1 environmental review for that property.
Second.
That was the motion.
is that a motion?
Yes.
I'll second it, but I'd also like, in the discussion,
Motion and second on the question.
okay. Can we at least, I mean, there's not a lot of residents there, so if we can get a notification, or at least a copy of the staff report, just to inform them that we are moving forward on some information on this.
Okay. Anything else? All in favor?
Through the chair, actually,
Michael.
before we vote, I just wanted to get a little clarification. And so the intent is that we move forward with at least considering purchasing the property, but acquiring.
We don't want to buy it. They should give it to us.
Okay, we're assuming it's up for grabs. And it does seem to make sense to me that the city should probably own, I mean, no other entity has any real interest in the property, and so probably the city should take ownership of it. But I think I personally would like to have a little bit better of an idea what we intend to do with it before we move forward with planning to purchase it. And I don't know what the rest of the council thinks about that. Maybe, I mean, we didn't really talk so much about, okay, what do we do with it if we do acquire it? So I'd like to hear maybe a little bit of discussion, or at least some ideas on what the rest of you have in mind for this property, should we come to own it.
I would think that the first thing we have to do is to make sure that, in fact, it's not some horrible, toxic mess. I think we have to approach Bart, who has to approach Samtrans, and say, this is what we'd like to do to get on solid ground. We want to make sure that Phase 1 environmental should pass, and if we have to go to Phase 2, I think we have discussions there. But I think we have to make sure that it's in fact safe to pursue further negotiations, especially with the neighborhood, as to what they'd like to see done with it. So I think, I don't want to speculate a lot on what we might be able to do with the property before we even know that the property is safe to do anything with.
So, just in terms of clarity, so I'll ask staff this: if we decided that we were going to acquire this and pave it over and just create more parking spots, would the environmental analysis have any bearing? Versus if we wanted to turn it into a playground.
I don't know for sure, because I don't know for sure. Disturbing there's a couple of different issues. One is the use after improvement, and the other is disturbance of the soil. That can have bearing on the answer to the question, and I'm sorry to say at this point, we don't really know anything about the property except that people are complaining about its appearance and have an interest in potentially putting it into productive use. So I think I would have to defer until we had at least a little bit more information.
Okay. I'm sorry. So pretty much the answer then is, no matter what we do with it, there is a potential for, if there is something toxic there, that we would disturb it and cause an environmental issue, and so we would want to do that. I guess the other alternative is we just leave it alone. We just keep cleaning it, and in that case, then there is no potential for environmental.
Potentially, but then you own it. So I mean, it's just,
so you want to know
it's
what you own.
just
Okay.
a prudent recommendation for somebody who's acquiring a piece of property that has, let's just say, an industrial history and no recent information or analysis.
Okay.
If I
Mark?
may just add through the chair, one of the complexities of this is that I think it's reasonable to assume that the owner of the property knows more about it than we do. So it's also possible the owner of the property, when we approach them to say, we'd like to do a Phase 1 on your property, they might say, well, we're not so interested in that. Because we're a Phase 1 to show that there was contamination or a problem, they would then be responsible for actually doing something about it, irrespective of whether there's going to be development on the property. So I think that once we start the process, we should be able to figure out fairly easily what the interests of the owner of the property are in that regard, and we'll learn something about what they know, I think.
Okay.
Okay,
All right. Thank you.
all right.
And I don't anticipate, if I could, I don't anticipate turning it all into a parking lot either. And I think the circulation issue is a big issue, so that they can at least park normally along a street and still maintain a good width of a street. You know, but then you're still going to be left with some separation there. You know, even no matter how wide, I think we make it.
Okay, just to clarify, I believe there's a motion on the floor with a second to talk to BART about conducting a Phase 1 environmental in our interest in potentially taking over the property. Is that correct? Okay. On the question, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So carried.